Future Hindsight. Where do we start the reconstruction of American democracy? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport, tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. Next week, the United States turns 250. It's a moment to assess the state of our democracy and what it could still become. To fulfill the promise that a free people could govern themselves, we should think of democracy and material security as intertwined in the project of America. So, reconstructing democracy starts somewhere specific, with policymaking that builds durable power in people's lives. The stakes are high, whether or not democracy delivers on its founding promise. Our guest today is Hertel-Fernandez, a labor policy scholar who served in the Biden administration at the Labor Department and White House and is now the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Alex joined us on the pod back in 2020 to discuss his book, State Capture: How Conservative Activists, Big Businesses, and Wealthy Donors Reshaped the American States and the Nation. This book truly forms the foundation of my own understanding of state politics, and it remains one of my favorite recommendations to anyone who wants to know more about how state governments work. We're so thrilled to have Alex back on the show. And before we start, I'm super excited to share that Future Hindsight will be bringing you a brand new podcast series this summer. In 2011, activists camped out in downtown Manhattan for almost 2 months on the heels of one of the worst financial crises America had ever seen. And now, 15 years later, we'll be sharing that story, the story of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Tune in July 9th to catch the first episode of Occupy, an Unfinished Uprising. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining us again.
Thanks so much, Mila, and thanks so much for the kind words about state capture. I'm excited for this conversation.
Let's start with the dream before we get anywhere near the how. America turns 250. The founders promised a free people could govern themselves, but they didn't really talk about the economic half of that promise. They really talked about the freedoms, most importantly. And if we were to finally get this right, where democracy and people's material conditions were woven together, what would that America actually look and feel like for an ordinary person?
I think you're right to say that many people think about democracy in terms of the ballot box and what it looks like to have elected representatives who are responsive to their constituents, to the people. But when I think about democracy, I really take a much broader perspective, and one that I think is resonant with many other thinkers throughout American history. And that thinks about democracy not just at the ballot box, but across our economy, and says we can't have a true democracy if we have unequal distributions of power in our economy. The vision of democracy that I think we need to rebuild and reimagine as we turn 250 is one in which all Americans have voice in the workplace and at the ballot box and have equal opportunities in our economy and to shape our public policies in our government.
Right. Well, it's super exciting that you have been in the government to help make some of these things possible. And I want to touch here on some of the findings from your research on deliverism, because so much, I think, of democracy also rests on how government delivers, and when government doesn't deliver or is perceived to not deliver, I firmly believe that erodes confidence in democracy. It delegitimizes the relevance, of democracy in our lives. And you found something deflating. Workers who received expanded unemployment benefits during the pandemic grew more supportive of the program, but did not become more politically active and not warmer toward the administration. So even though the government was delivering, it didn't translate to actually building political power for the administration and the White House. So it seems to me from some of this research that good policy wins votes is maybe not expansive enough. And of course, the evidence is clear that even though some of these unemployment insurance programs worked really well during the pandemic in 2024, President Trump was reelected. So how can you turn a received benefit into political power?
Yeah, so the last administration that I had the privilege of serving in under President Biden and Vice President Harris very much had the idea that to rebuild trust and democracy, that the federal government had to deliver and deliver in big ways for the American people. And there were a lot of inherited needs that the Biden administration received when it came into office. First and foremost was the COVID-19 pandemic. There was the economic crisis associated with the pandemic, with many people unable to show up to work in person, many businesses shuttered. And then there were more longstanding crises, like the climate crisis that we were facing. The administration tried to address these through bold new policies, including the American Rescue Plan Act that pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy to help people through checks to keep households afloat, unemployment benefits to help people who couldn't go back to work, assistance to state and local governments, assistance to people who are facing eviction, many other benefits. But as I and other people have found from these programs, not a lot of people were able to connect the experiences that they had with these programs back to government. And I think that's consistent with a broader set of research studies on the structure of government. And that really highlights just how much government does that goes unnoticed by people. Suzanne Mettler, a fantastic political scientist at Cornell, has this great concept known as the submerged state, that so much of what the federal government does is below the waterline and hard for people to see and feel in their lives. And in some ways, that's to be expected. We live in an enormously fragmented news media environment where it's hard for people to get trusted political news about what's happening in their lives. Many people are no longer part of associations like labor unions or community groups that might have helped them understand where those benefits were coming from, who was responsible for passing them, and then helping them connect those experiences back into government action. And on top of that, a lot of the benefits were administered indirectly. So for instance, a big chunk of the rescue money that the American Rescue Plan Act was pumping into the economy was flowing through states and local governments. And so that makes it hard to understand, who really deserves credit. My takeaway is that if you want policy to register with people, that it has to be done in a highly visible way and in partnership with community-based groups, membership groups that have trusted relationships with members of the public that can help people connect the dots of their experiences. So take one of the most important accomplishments of the Biden administration's recovery effort, expansions to the child tax credit that for 1 year halved child poverty. Let me say that one more time. It cut child poverty in half. For so many years, we'd accepted a high level of child poverty in this country, and we discovered there's a great way of solving that problem, and that's giving checks to poor families. And yet, when it came time to debate the expansion of that and turning it into a permanent benefit, there wasn't a lot of groundswell among families that had received these benefits. And I think that's because there was no organization that was mobilizing these parents to say, this is the benefit that you received from government. It's on the chopping block. You need to turn out to protest, to write to your members of Congress, to show up in elections and really make your voice heard. So what I take away for future social and economic policy making is that we need to do more to spur that kind of civic organizing, delivering benefits in partnership with worker organizations or parent organizations that I'm happy to share more about as well.
Yeah, I want to definitely discuss that. But before we do that, I want you to tell us about why it's important to build power. And you just alluded to this, that, if they had more power, then the people who were the recipients would demand from their elected representatives not to cut the checks for expanded child tax credit. Because that was, I thought, a really big deal. And I think the media talked about it a lot. But then we saw basically zero footage on television with families who were recipients. Instead, we saw, senators or other members of Congress in the House talk about how we can't afford it or whatnot, and then basically it was not extended. And I thought actually that was a failure of the administration. And that's another question. But tell us about why it's important to build power, and then what does that power look like?
Yeah, so democracy is not a static thing that we constantly need to fight to rejuvenate democracy and make it work for working people. And for that to happen, working people need to have organized power. When I look across American history, frankly, in other countries as well, the times that I see democracy as delivering and working for working people, delivering policies that improve their material conditions, that expand social, economic, and civil rights. It's when people have organized into durable movements like labor unions, civil rights organizations, parents organizations, consumer organizations. And when those organizations have faded, democracy is less responsive to working people and just delivers far less. So I think about these breakthrough moments, whether it was Reconstruction, for instance, that introduced for the first time, especially in the South, progress towards a multiracial democracy, the New Deal that created a middle class and created economic security for millions of American workers, albeit incomplete and divided along gender and racial lines, or the Great Society that delivered progress on civil rights and economic inclusion. These were all moments when you had organized civil society power. And I think that's what we need to make American democracy work. And I think there's a way in which you can think about policy as creating opportunities to build civil society power, like I just described, that can then create these virtuous cycles where policy, for instance, makes it easier for workers to form labor unions. Labor unions can then ensure that workers get the gains that they deserve in the workplace and at the ballot box and in government, further securing gains that can be shared broadly across the economy. So I'm really interested in these ways that we can think about using government to spur more durable civil society power.
Yeah, so tell us about the civil society power. How do you organize that?
So organizing is hard, particularly when it's people who don't have a lot of formal power otherwise. When you're a multi-billionaire, say to take one example, like Elon Musk, you have a lot of ways to obtain influence and power in our society. You can pick up the phone and call the president and, the next day get a post inside of government where you have the opportunity to radically reshape what the federal government does. When you're a working person, person of color, someone who hasn't had a lot of power in our society today, you need durable organization, people power to make it work. And that's harder to build. But we know how to do it. We can look to the civil rights movement. We can look to the labor movement for examples of how durable people power is secured. And I think there are lessons we can take away, for instance, from the legislation that created the American labor movement, the National Labor Relations Act passed during the New Deal, that, for instance, acknowledged a federal right to form a union of your choosing at your job that protects you against retaliation if you do organize with your coworkers. Admittedly, that law could be greatly strengthened, and we can talk about how there's a lot of unmet demand for labor organizing, but you can see the rough outline of what a framework could look like. So imagine if we didn't just have that framework for workers, but imagine if we had an organizing framework for parents or for tenants or for recipients of the child tax credit that would create parents' unions that would be durable organizations that would represent the interests of working families and push for things like childcare, push for things like paid leave for family needs, that would push for things like the expanded child tax credit, and then work with government to really make it happen and make sure it's implemented well. That's the kind of vision of the virtuous cycle between policy and organizing and power that I'm envisioning.
I think that's a great idea. And you actually, in some of the writings that I've read, you talk about some of the navigator programs. That was such a concrete example of how civic groups can help make the policy come to life in the mind of the recipient and then make them want to become more organized and more engaged. Can you tell us about that example during the COVID days where these civic groups helped people access their unemployment insurance?
Sure. This is one of the examples that I am especially excited about. And I am proud that I had a very little role in the government that was pushing these forward. And it was neat to see them realized. So during the pandemic, the federal government enacted a series of expansions to unemployment benefits to make it easier for people to qualify, to extend the time for which benefits were available, and to increase the generosity of benefits. But there were a lot of hoops that people had to jump through, even with those changes, to access benefits. And there were a number of people who were having trouble getting benefits in a timely way. So one of the things that we did in the Biden administration Department of Labor was to create a grant program where states could partner with trusted worker organizations or community groups that had relationships with groups of workers who weren't accessing unemployment benefits to teach people, here's the program, here's how you apply, we'll help you apply, we'll help you navigate that process. If you get denied, we'll help you appeal, we'll help you understand what all these jargon terms that get used in unemployment insurance applications mean. And we'll also connect you with work search opportunities. A requirement for unemployment insurance benefits is that you engage in work search. And so they were helping workers do that, access training opportunities. So as you said, we found that these navigators were able to, one, help more people understand how the policy worked and if they were eligible. Two, we found that these navigators helped people, especially vulnerable, marginalized communities, actually claim the benefits at higher rates and in a timelier fashion. And three, they were able to tell people the story of the policy. I love how you put it. Bring the policy to life for people. They were able to explain, this is a program that was enacted under this administration. This is how it works. We also find that those workers were more interested in collective action on the job because they had a chance to interact with people who told them about their labor rights, for instance. And that might have been the first time that they had gotten an explanation of what their federal rights to form a union were or their rights to collective action on the job. So I am excited about the possibility for the government, and this could be the federal government, states, or local governments, to expand the use of these navigator-like programs, providing support for trusted community groups who can connect people with government services and in the process, form part of the civic fabric that we need to build civil society power.
Yeah, and it makes government/democracy legible to the everyday person. So I have a question about Solidarity Net. That's something that you propose. What is your vision for, quote, Solidarity Net, and how is it different from what you just talked about?
I am right now working on a book that tries to reframe how we think about the safety net, not just as a way to support economic needs, but to build worker power. We know right now there are far more workers who want voice and power on the job than who have access to it. Right now, only about 10% of American workers are in a union. The number is even lower if you look at just private sector workers. But when you look at surveys of non-union workers, you have anywhere from over 30% to over half of private sector workers who say, I'd like a union at my job if I had the option to join one. So we see there's a lot of unmet demand. So I'm interested in ways that we can connect workers with opportunities for unions or other kinds of collective representation. And I think the safety net actually could play a role in doing that. And I think the safety net can do two things to build worker power: buffering and bridging. So let me explain what both of those mean in turn. So by buffering, the safety net can better subsidize or lower the risks that people take when they organize and engage in collective action on the job. So right now in the United States, it is just a simple fact that workers who exercise their federal legal rights to say, go on strike, protest their employment conditions, try and form a union, are subject to an immense amount of illegal employer retaliation. But when you look at the numbers, employers are blatantly breaking the law in so many union drives, and they just do not face the kind of financial penalties that would discourage that kind of behavior. An employer rationally knows it's easier just to fire a worker who's starting to speak up or engage in a union drive than to accept a union at my workplace. And the government just lacks the teeth to be able to enforce that law. But if you can make workers more comfortable taking those risks by, for instance, increasing unemployment insurance benefits or food assistance or health insurance, you can make workers more comfortable taking the risks that they need to be able to form a union at their job. And we've seen this historically, including in the COVID period most recently. When COVID expanded access to unemployment insurance benefits, it increased the willingness of workers to do things like speak out against unsafe working conditions or protest or picket their employer, because they knew if they lost their job, there was more of a fallback option for them. So that's the buffering vision of the safety net. I also describe how the safety net can be a bridge into worker organizations. So I imagine a safety net where navigators like unions or other worker organizations are playing a bigger role in helping make the safety net legible and accessible to workers. And in the process, workers have an opportunity to connect with someone who can tell them about their federal labor rights. What if, when it came time to file for your unemployment benefit or to apply for Medicaid or to apply for housing assistance, you could go to a union center in your neighborhood and get help applying for that benefit. And the union could also tell you, here are your federal labor rights and here's how you'd form a union at your job. If you don't want to form a union, that's totally fine. But if you want to, we can connect you with organizers who can help you. So that's the vision of the safety net as a bridge into building more worker power and into more worker organizing that I envision. So the buffering and bridging are the two sides of this vision.
We'll be back with Alex in just a moment, so stick around. You've got to hear this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, picture this. It's late at night and you're doing a little scrolling when all of a sudden you see it, that one product that you've been looking for. You click on the link, add to cart, and maybe even shop around a little more before finally hitting checkout. But as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And that's when you see it, that purple pay button that has all of your information saved, making checking out as simple as a simple tap of your screen. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Death Wish Coffee to up-and-coming brands that are just getting started. And Shopify is there for you, too. Accelerate your efficiency, whether you're uploading new products or trying to improve existing ones. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Now, you might be wondering, what if people haven't heard about my brand? It's okay. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. So tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. Everything is all in one spot, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. See fewer carts go abandoned and more sales go cha-ching with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. We also want to share about a podcast we think you'll enjoy called the Jacob Shapiro Podcast.
Geopolitics is not an abstraction. It is always personal. When Florida's orange industry collapses, the impact is borne by individual farmers. When cartels rewrite a country's political map, everyday citizens pay the cost. When a critical maritime choke point closes, the price you pay for essentials goes up. I'm Jacob Shapiro, and every week I find the story underneath the story. The Jacob Shapiro Podcast. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Alex Hertel-Fernandez. When you empower workers to take more risk, you can get different kinds of side benefits and not just economic ones. So, in fact, I think you would argue very forcefully that economics requires democracy. An effective economy in the United States would require democracy. How do you think about the threat of right-wing populism in separating economics from democracy? Because I think a lot of people on the right are saying we don't need democracy, we just need economic populism in the way that they conceive it.
Yeah. So around the world, and the United States is no exception, we're seeing this surge of support in voting for candidates and parties that espouse right-wing authoritarian views. And there's been an immense amount of research trying to understand why this has been the case. Undoubtedly, there are many factors. One of them is, for instance, the changing demographic profile of many countries with a surge in immigration that has generated backlash from people who are fearful of a changing society and sometimes outright xenophobic or racist. But in other cases, we've seen the declining economic fortunes of workers drive disenchantment with democracy and a willingness and a hunger for these kinds of right-wing authoritarian candidates. And I think it's hard to parse out the role of culture and economics here. I think they're deeply connected. I'll give you a couple examples. There's been research showing that free trade deals that have hollowed out a lot of manufacturing jobs that used to be good-paying union jobs in the Midwest, that those places that were hit hardest by the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in the 1990s, that those were the places that tended to move more strongly to support Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential primary. And it was often people who already held conservative views on social issues that were pulled further in that direction. So it's sort of the interaction of economics and culture together. So what do I take away from this? I think one lesson is that the kind of economic policies that past governments around the world have pursued, especially with regards to trade, cutbacks to the safety net, the decline of support for labor unions, that this has generated a well of resentment that can be tapped by canny politicians like Donald J. Trump. The second thing I take away is actually a little bit heartbreaking, that in some cases, the diagnosis put forward by these voters and leaders is half right, that when they are arguing that our democracy has been captured by elites, there's some degree of truth to that. When we look, for instance, at the responsiveness of the federal government in the United States to what working people want, we see that both parties have honestly failed to represent their economic preferences. For instance, Democrats and Republicans pursued trade agreements that many working class people disagreed with. Democrats and Republicans failed to update labor laws that would increase the power of labor unions. And Democrats and Republicans have failed to increase the minimum wage and increase working standards for working people. This is a failure, honestly, of both parties. The tragic part about this diagnosis being half right is it's also half wrong. When you look at many of these right-wing authoritarian leaders, like President Trump right now, they're not pursuing policies that are restoring the working or middle class. Instead, you're seeing a massive amount of upwards redistribution. In fact, the signature domestic policy legislation pursued by Donald Trump is one of the singularly most upwardly redistributive measures in American history, cutting social programs for the poorest Americans to support tax cuts for some of the wealthiest Americans and corporations. So they're not getting the economic gains, and these are individuals who are breaking our democratic institutions and norms. Policymakers need to think about how their economic policies do not just change economic outcomes, but how they change support for democracy. If you think about trade policy or labor policy or social safety net policies, these are policies that have implications for how people think about democracy delivering or not for them. And so I think we need to think about democracy as a kind of outcome that policymakers, even those who might think of themselves as just in the economic policy vein, should be prioritizing.
Right. So policy making should be focused on bolstering democracy on whatever policy that they're working on, whether that's economics or trade or climate or whatnot. Actually, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, this is excellent. So I have a question about economic populism on the left, because, we just talked about the right, but their grievance is the same, right? That the system is rigged against them. The 1% is taking everything and the 99% stands out in the cold. And while the right is really aiming at immigrants and elites, even though the elites are still fleecing them, how does economic populism fit into your analysis of the current policymaking picture in terms of economics for democracy And is a leftist version of economic populism actually better for democracy? Can it strengthen democracy? Or is it just another mirage?
It's a great question. And the first thing to say is, at least in the United States and other Western European countries, really the dominant thrust has tended to be populism on the right rather than the left. But that's not to say that there aren't forces of left-wing populism here in the United States and other countries. When I think about someone like Representative Ocasio-Cortez or Senator Sanders, or even our mayor here in New York, Zoran Mamdani, that you hear versions of more left-wing oriented populism. The key question to me as to whether populism can be compatible with democracy is really twofold. One, how do the populists think about underlying democratic norms and institutions? And is the populism inclusive or exclusionary? And I think on those two marks, often the populism on the left that you see here in the United States is operating within the bounds of our democratic norms and institutions. That while someone like Senator Sanders or Representative Ocasio-Cortez view parts of our political system as fundamentally broken and corrupt, they aren't trying to overthrow our system of democratic norms and institutions in the same way as, say, Donald Trump is, or seeking reform to overturn the rule of law as members of Congress who are allied with Donald Trump are, or some of Trump's oligarch allies like Peter Thiel. But they're operating within the bounds of a democracy. They're saying, for instance, we should have campaign finance reform that curbs the ability of wealthy people to translate their resources into political access, or businesses to engage in political access as well. But they're not calling, for instance, for a weaponization of government against political opponents or curbing the franchise for individuals. And then the second part is inclusionary versus exclusionary rhetoric and policy. And here too, while the left-wing populists often take aim at the economic elite in our country, they aren't talking about vilifying or really casting out of society, marginalized groups, for instance, immigrants or LGBTQ individuals. It's a much more inclusionary vision of who counts as the we in democracy. So I think those visions of populism are compatible with democracy and indeed may be responsive to this moment where you see so much discontent with our political system that, in my view, it's going to be hard for a politician to win, especially a national office, if they aren't fundamentally recognizing and taking on the fact that so many people feel like our political institutions have let us down.
For sure they have. So that's the other thing. It's not that they haven't. It isn't hypothetical, We are where we are because it has failed us. We are currently experiencing a real economic crisis in this country in a way that I think people are maybe denying. The fact that we are at war in the Middle East and that I don't think oil prices are coming down in a significant way anytime soon. And we are, I believe, shooting ourselves in the foot by not being competitive in renewable energy. So all of that business down the line is going to go elsewhere instead of staying in this country. Not to mention the immense amount of corruption that is happening and basically stealing everybody's hard-earned tax dollars. As you think about righting the ship through economic policy for democracy, when all of this is done, where would you start?
That is spot on, that the United States really does face immense economic headwinds and crises, some of which are not fully realized at the moment, but I think we're going to pay for in the coming years. To the list that you've added, I would also add basically ending inflows of immigrants into this country with some exceptions. My family immigrated to the United States. I count myself as being part of that. That group of people have fueled so much of our economy. And with an aging population, we know this is a recipe for disaster in terms of the demographic profile of the country. Similarly, I think about the massive cuts that the federal government under the Trump administration has made to research and development, through the university system that has in turn fueled so many innovations in pharmaceutical companies to our cell phones. And the tragic thing when I hear all of the cuts that are being made to research and development is that we're not going to know the PhD dissertations that don't get written, that aren't going to result in, new cancer cures or new cures for heart disease or new inventions that could fundamentally improve our lives. So I agree that the picture is dim right now, but I am not losing hope, and I am hopeful for a couple of reasons. One is that I think you've seen massive support across the country for restoring a vision of democracy that would address the blatant corruption and authoritarianism of the current administration. I think about the No Kings protests, for instance, that I've seen millions and millions of people all across the country, not just in blue cities like New York, but really all across the country. I was so struck when I was attending my sister's weddings in rural Massachusetts, a tiny town. I thought for sure there's not going to be No Kings protest, but there was. People drove in from all of these small hill towns in Western Massachusetts to attend a No Kings protest last fall. So that gives me hope. And I think the next Congress and the next pro-democracy leader at the federal level is going to have to harness that energy. And the first thing they have to do is structural reform to our political system that can start to weed out the corruption that we've seen, that can rebalance power between the branches of government. We haven't talked about this, but there is an immense amount of capture of our judiciary, too much power concentrated in the presidency. We need to rebalance Congress's role as the first branch of government to be able to oversee policy, particularly spending policy, but across a whole wide range of issues. You need to have campaign finance reform. And honestly, tax reform is part of that. I think in a society, we're seeing that immense amount of economic concentration, hundreds of billions of dollars in the hands of just a handful of individuals is just not compatible with a healthy functioning democracy. And so tax policy needs to be on the table as part of that bundle of structural democracy reform.
Yeah, those are all great ideas. So we are a civic engagement podcast, and we always want to inspire our audience to take civic action. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you have just shared with us into action?
Such a great question. And a key theme of what we've been talking about is how durable civil society power requires organizations of people. And so I think my civic spark would be to find an organization in your community and to join it and to show up and to be in community with other people right now. I just found that to be so immensely uplifting to, be part of the No Kings protests, to be part of local community groups who are thinking about resisting the actions of this administration and their incursions on democracy. So I'd encourage people to find organizations at the local level who are involved in that resistance.
Last question. You kind of already answered this about what makes you hopeful, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer that again with something specifically happening in the civic society sphere. So looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is, in part, the mobilization that we've seen, as I mentioned, with No Kings, but also how we're already seeing at the local and the state level energy for a new vision of democracy and an economy being translated into actual policy changes. At the federal level, we're going to have to wait for elections this year, a presidential election, to see policy change at those levels of government. But at the local and the state level, we're already seeing amazing accomplishments, whether it's expanding childcare, addressing climate change, or addressing the affordability crisis. In our city of New York, in states like New Mexico, in states like California, we're seeing, I think, important steps to addressing all of these aspects of our crisis of democracy and the economy.
Here, totally agree. I mean, I also live in New York, and my favorite policy that the Mamdani administration has put forward is to have universal childcare. I think that's a transformative policy for all families in New York, and I think will essentially make the economy work for democracy. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining me on Future Hindsight again. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for this conversation, Mila.
Alex Hertel-Fernandez is a labor policy scholar who served in the Biden administration at the Labor Department and the White House, and is now the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Find an organization in your community and join. Sometimes it's really that simple. Now, more than ever, it's important to be in community and to show up. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be sharing your first look at our brand new series, Occupy, an Unfinished Uprising. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode of Future Hindsight's Occupy series. Oh, and while you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way for new listeners to find the show. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We are here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Head to youtube.com/futurehindsight now. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,